In the spotlight tonight, the Occupy Wall Street protests continued into its 17th day today after a weekend of mass arrests. On Saturday, more than 700 people were arrested during a peaceful march on the Brooklyn Bridge for allegedly blocking the roadway. Many witnesses insist the protesters were lured onto the bridge by the police, who then rounded up 700 of them for disorderly conduct and blocking vehicular traffic. The arrested protesters were put in plastic handcuffs and bused to police precincts. Most were given a summons and released overnight. This weekend proved that the unbridled police violence that broke out last weekend was not a necessary component of crowd control. On Wednesday, the protesters will march on Wall Street, joined by members of the Service Employees International Union, the Communication Workers Union, the New York AFL-CIO, and the United Federation of Teachers. As is customary in such large-scale protests, many well-known people have spoken publicly in support of the protesters, including Michael Moore, who joined us live from the protest site last week. It is not customary for street protests of this kind to attract Nobel Prize-winning economists. The appearance of Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz at the protests on Sunday is the latest indicator that this protest is something we have never seen before.
We socialize losses and privatize gains. That's a distorted economy, and if we continue with that, we won't succeed in growing, and we won't succeed in creating a just society.
Joining me now is Columbia University economics professor Joseph Stiglitz, who served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton. Thank you very much for joining me tonight, Professor.
Nice to be here.
Now, with a career in academia, in university life, you have had many opportunities to be in protests, in loud, noisy protests about many things. What brought you to Lower Manhattan this weekend?
Well, the United States is in a severe economic problem, and unfortunately, our leaders in Washington haven't done enough about it. I've been surprised that there haven't been protests earlier. The way our democracy obviously needs a stimulus to make our leaders in Washington hear the pain that so many Americans, and particularly our youth, are now feeling.
Professor, you did a Vanity Fair piece earlier this year, which was titled "Of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. How did our government come to this?
Well, that's actually one of the points I make in that article, that this government of the 1%, for the 1%, by the 1% perpetuates itself. It passes rules, it allows the banks to get deregulated, it restricts our democracy. In fact, I began my comments yesterday by pointing out that we have too little regulation of banks, but too much regulation of our democratic processes. I could not talk yesterday with a normal bullhorn. I've talked in discussions in other places. This is the first time that there's been that kind of restraint in communicating with a large group. And it seems to me that, we were trying to discuss what was the cause of the crisis, what could be done, how could they articulate their concerns. And it had to be done in this very peculiar way, which pedagogically may have been useful, as they repeated everything I said and then went down around the whole group, but it's not the way other countries have allowed their demonstrations to communicate with each other.
The protesters have not isolated any kind of legislative package that they would like to see come out of this. They have not said this is what we need in order to achieve our goals. If you were to suggest to them one thing, just one thing to ask of Washington, what would be that number one thing?
Create more jobs. Do what you have to do to get our economy back to work. The fact is that for so many of the young people gathered there, their prospects of getting a good job within the next year, 2 years, is not very good. And they played by the rules. They've done what they were supposed to do. Many of them worked hard in college, worked their way through college. And yet now they see very few prospects and a knowledge that when they get a job, it will not be up what they had aspired to.
And do you have a quick response to the economically illiterate Republicans who insist that government cannot do anything to help create jobs?
I say go back to the Great Depression. If it had not been for government, that desert of jobs, that absence of jobs would have lasted far longer. The WPA has left a legacy of monuments, of things that we still enjoy. And eventually, it was World War II. But that was a government job created jobs. Unfortunately, rather than that being devoted to investing to make our country stronger, it was necessary to spend that to protect ourselves from enemies abroad.
Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economist and professor at Columbia University, thank you very much for joining me tonight. It's an honor to have you here.
Nice to be here.